They called them tin cans, a nickname born not from affection, but from brutal honesty. These destroyers, with hulls barely thick enough to stop a rifle bullet, were all that stood between Japan's mighty battleships and the American supply lines stretching across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, in the Philippines, a handful of these tin cans would face the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. What happened in the next 2 hours would become one of the most extraordinary battles in naval history. Yet for decades, the full story of America's destroyer squadrons in the Pacific remained largely untold, overshadowed by aircraft carriers, buried beneath the glory of battleships, forgotten in the rush to celebrate victory. This is their story. The Pacific War began with catastrophe. When Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they shattered more than battleships. They destroyed America's confidence in its naval supremacy. In the chaos of those first terrible months, as Japan swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, capturing Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, one type of warship proved indispensable: the destroyer. While battleships burned in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor and aircraft carriers maneuvered cautiously in distant waters, destroyers became the workhorses of a navy struggling to survive. They escorted the few precious carriers that remained. They hunted submarines in waters where Japanese torpedoes lurked beneath every wave. They rescued downed pilots. They bombarded enemy beaches. They fought surface actions against superior forces. And they died, often alone, always outnumbered, rarely remembered. The American destroyers of 1941 were evolved weapons, the product of decades of naval architecture and bitter lessons from the First World War. The Fletcher-class destroyers, which would become the backbone of the Pacific destroyer force, displaced 2,050 tons and stretched 376 feet from bow to stern. They carried 5 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and enough depth charges to sink a dozen submarines. Their steam turbines could push them to 37 knots, fast enough to keep pace with carriers, fast enough to run from battleships, fast enough to chase down enemy destroyers in the darkness. But speed and armament meant nothing without the men who operated them. And in 1941, the United States Navy was desperately short of trained sailors. The men who would crew these destroyers came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa who had never seen the ocean. Factory workers from Detroit who understood engines but not navigation. College students who had traded their books for battle stations. High school graduates from small towns with names like Pawnee City and Painted Post, places so small they barely appeared on maps, where every family would feel the loss when a destroyer went down. They arrived at training centers on both coasts, wide-eyed and uncertain, where veteran chiefs, hard men who had served since the 1920s, would transform them into sailors. The training was brutal, because the Pacific would be more brutal still. They learned to fight fires in pitch darkness, to patch holes while water roared through fractured hulls, to load 5-inch guns until their hands bled, to operate radar systems so new that the technology barely worked. Most of all, they learned that on a destroyer there was no safe place to hide. One torpedo, one bomb, one well-placed shell could send a tin can to the bottom in minutes. The destroyers organized into squadrons, groups of ships that would train together, fight together, and often die together. Destroyer Squadron 54, Destroyer Squadron 21, Destroyer Squadron 23. These numbers meant nothing to civilians, but to the men who served in them, they represented family. Each squadron developed its own personality, its own tactics, its own legends. Destroyer Squadron 23, commanded by Captain Arleigh Burke, became known as the Little Beavers, a name that captured both their industriousness and their aggressive spirit. Burke, a tough, innovative officer who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, drilled his destroyers relentlessly. He developed new tactics for night fighting, new methods for coordinating torpedo attacks, new signals that could be understood in the chaos of combat. His destroyers would fight in 22 separate engagements without losing a single ship, a record unmatched in the Pacific War. The early months of 1942 were desperate times. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, their navy appearing wherever it wished, striking with impunity. American destroyers fought delaying actions, covering retreats, buying time with their lives. In the Java Sea in February 1942, Allied destroyers charged Japanese cruisers in a doomed attempt to stop the invasion of Java. The destroyer USS Pope fought until her ammunition was exhausted, her captain finally ordering abandon ship as Japanese shells turned her into a floating inferno. The destroyer USS Stuart, damaged in combat, fell into Japanese hands when the Allies evacuated Java, later serving in the Japanese Navy, the only American destroyer to fight for the enemy. These were dark days when victory seemed impossible and survival was the only goal. But destroyers learned, adapted, evolved. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked the turning point, not just for the war, but for American destroyer tactics. While dive bombers from American carriers struck the killing blows against 4 Japanese carriers, destroyers played crucial roles that historians often overlook. They screened the carriers from submarine attack, their sonar operators hunting Japanese submarines that stalked the American task forces. They rescued dozens of downed divators, picking up exhausted pilots from the cold Pacific waters. The destroyer USS Hammond was sunk by a Japanese submarine while alongside the carrier USS Yorktown, her stern blown off by torpedoes, 50 men lost in the explosion, a reminder that even in victory, destroyers paid in blood. The campaign for Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, would prove to be the crucible where destroyer squadrons were forged into elite fighting forces. The waters off Guadalcanal, called Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships that would sink there, became a destroyer sailor's nightmare. By day, American forces controlled the sea, but every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers raced down from Rabaul in what Marines on Guadalcanal called the Tokyo Express, high-speed runs to deliver troops and supplies, to bombard Henderson Field, to hunt American ships in savage night battles. American destroyers had to stop them. The first naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought on the night of November 12 through 13, 1942, was chaos incarnate. In darkness broken only by searchlights and gun flashes, American destroyers charged into a Japanese force that included the battleship Hiei. The destroyer USS Laffey found herself caught between 2 Japanese battleships, exchanging point-blank fire with ships that outweighed her 10-1. She fired every gun she had, her 5-inch shells bouncing off armored hulls but refusing to retreat. Japanese shells tore through her thin plating, starting fires, killing her crew, destroying her bridge. She sank 20 minutes after the battle began, but her sacrifice helped save the Marines on Guadalcanal. The destroyer USS Cushing was blown apart by Japanese gunfire. The destroyer USS Monson took 37 direct hits and burned until morning, when her survivors abandoned her flaming hulk. The destroyer USS Barton, newly arrived from the Atlantic, was struck by 2 Japanese torpedoes and sank in seconds, so quickly that most of her crew went down with her. But the Japanese paid too. The battleship Hiei, crippled by repeated attacks, was scuttled the next day. The Americans learned that destroyers, handled with courage and aggression, could challenge any enemy. The tactics refined at Guadalcanal radar-guided gunnery, coordinated torpedo attacks, aggressive maneuvering would serve destroyer squadrons for the rest of the war. Every captain studied the lessons written in blood off Guadalcanal. Every crew trained harder, knowing that the next night battle might be their last. As 1943 progressed, American destroyer squadrons went on the offensive. The Central Solomon Islands campaign saw destroyers fighting in restricted waters where maneuverability mattered more than numbers. The Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943 demonstrated how far destroyer tactics had evolved. 6 American destroyers, led by Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, intercepted 4 Japanese destroyers attempting another Tokyo Express run. Using radar to coordinate their attack, the American destroyers launched torpedoes from long range, then opened fire with their 5-inch guns. In less than 30 minutes, 3 Japanese destroyers were sinking and the 4th was fleeing. Not a single American destroyer was hit. It was a perfect execution of the tactics developed in the crucible of Guadalcanal. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943 showcased destroyer initiative and adaptability. When American cruisers engaged Japanese cruisers, 4 American destroyers, USS Spence, USS Thatcher, USS Converse, and USS Foote, charged the Japanese line, launching torpedoes at ranges where they could hardly miss. Japanese destroyers counterattacked, and USS Foote took a torpedo that blew off her stern, but the American attack disrupted the Japanese formation so completely that the battle turned into an American victory. Foote's crew, displaying the determination that characterized destroyer sailors, kept their ship afloat and managed to bring her back to port where she would be repaired and returned to service. The isolation of Rabaul, Japan's great fortress in the South Pacific, required months of destroyer operations. Night after night, American destroyers bombarded Japanese positions, dodging return fire from shore batteries, racing away before Japanese aircraft could find them at dawn. These were exhausting operations, demanding constant vigilance. Sleep came in brief snatches. Hot meals were luxuries. The men lived on coffee and adrenaline, their nerves stretched thin by the constant threat of submarine attack, air attack, surface attack. Destroyers became rust-streaked and battle-worn, their paint scorched by gun blasts, their hulls dented by near misses, their crews hardened by months of continuous combat. By 1944, the American offensive was accelerating across the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign required destroyers for every operation, to screen carriers, to bombard beaches, to escort supply ships, to rescue downed pilots, to patrol against submarines. The Navy was building destroyers at an incredible rate. Shipyards on both coasts launched new destroyers every week, their hulls still smelling of fresh paint when they arrived in the Pacific. But building ships was easier than training crews, and many destroyers arrived with green crews who learned their trade under fire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the slaughter of Japanese aircraft, saw destroyers forming the outer defensive ring around the American carriers. As wave after wave of Japanese planes attacked, destroyer gunners fired their 5-inch guns, their 40mm anti-aircraft guns, their 20mm cannons, throwing up walls of steel that shredded Japanese aircraft. The destroyer USS Stockham shot down 4 Japanese planes. The destroyer USS Yarnall shot down 5. Their crews worked their guns until the barrels glowed red, until their ammunition was nearly exhausted, until their arms could barely lift another shell. The American carriers emerged unscathed, a testament to the destroyers that protected them. But the destroyers' greatest test was yet to come. In October 1944, American forces invaded the Philippines, MacArthur fulfilling his promise to return. The Japanese Navy, facing extinction, planned one final, desperate gamble, Operation Show-Go. A complex plan that would use Japanese carriers as bait to lure away the American carriers, allowing Japanese battleships and cruisers to break through and destroy the vulnerable American landing forces. The Japanese had 4 battleships in their center force, including the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, each displacing 72,000 tons, each carrying 9 18-inch guns that could fire 3,200-pound shells 25 miles. Against these monsters, the Americans deployed Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy-3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The morning of October 25, 1944, dawned clear and calm off Samar. Taffy-3's escort carriers were launching aircraft to support the troops ashore, their crews relaxed after days of routine operations. Then, at 6:45 a.m., the lookout on the destroyer USS Heermann spotted pagoda-like masts on the horizon. Japanese battleships. The commander of Taffy-3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a quiet, methodical officer who had never expected to face battleships, immediately grasped the disaster unfolding. The Japanese center force, which was supposed to have been stopped by American submarines and aircraft, had broken through. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers were bearing down on his 6 escort carriers, which were built on merchant ship hulls and had no armor to speak of. Sprague ordered his carriers to run east toward a rain squall that might provide cover, and turned to his destroyers. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, didn't wait for orders. Evans, part Cherokee Indian, had told his crew when Johnston commissioned, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now he took Johnston directly toward the Japanese battleships, laying a smokescreen to hide the carriers, firing his 5-inch guns at ranges where they could barely scratch Japanese armor. Johnston's first salvo struck the heady cruiser Kumano, and Evans pressed his attack, closing to 10,000 yards, point-blank range by naval standards. He launched all 10 torpedoes, and one of them struck Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of the battle. The destroyers USS Hoole and USS Heermann followed Johnston into the attack. Commander Leon Kintenberger, commanding Hoole, pointed his ship at the battleship Congo and charged. His 5-inch shells sparked harmlessly off Congo's thick armor, but Kintenberger didn't flinch. He fired his torpedoes and continued firing his guns, drawing Japanese fire away from the carriers. Japanese shells walked toward Hoole, stridling her with massive waterspouts. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck Hoole's bridge, killing Kintenberger and most of his officers. Hit after hit slammed into Hoole's thin hull. Her engine room flooded. Her forward guns were destroyed, but her surviving crew kept fighting from the afterguns, firing until the water reached the barrels. Hoole rolled over and sank at 8:55 a.m., taking 253 of her crew with her. Commander Amos Hathaway, commanding Heermann, maneuvered his destroyer with such aggressive skill that he dodged most of the Japanese shells aimed at his ship. He positioned Heermann between the Japanese battleships and the carriers, firing constantly, launching torpedoes, weaving through salvos of Japanese shells that raised waterspouts higher than Heermann's mast. At one point, Heermann found herself surrounded, Japanese ships on all sides, shells falling like rain. Hathaway ordered full speed, threading his destroyer between 2 Japanese battleships, passing so close that Heermann's crew could see Japanese sailors on the battleship's decks. Somehow, miraculously, Heermann survived. Johnston, damaged by multiple hits, her speed reduced to 17 knots, continued fighting. Commander Evans, wounded and burned, refused to leave the bridge. He positioned Johnston between a Japanese cruiser squadron and the escort carriers, engaging 7 Japanese cruisers with his remaining guns. A Japanese cruiser column shifted course to avoid Johnston's torpedoes that Johnston had already fired, but the Japanese didn't know that. Evans was bluffing with an empty hand, and the bluff worked. But Johnston's luck was running out. At 9:45 a.m., a 14-inch shell penetrated Johnston's engine room. Dead in the water, still firing her remaining gun, Johnston rolled over and sank at 9:45 a.m. Evans went down with her ship, one of 186 crew members who died with her. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, more lightly armed than fleet destroyers, attacked with equal ferocity. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., charged the Japanese line, firing over 600 5-inch shells in her final action. Her crew loaded and fired their guns so rapidly that the powder bags ignited, starting fires in the gun mounts, but they kept firing. A Japanese shell penetrated Roberts' engine room and she began to sink. Her survivors abandoned ship, clinging to life rafts and debris in shark-infested waters. Of her crew, 89 died. The rest would spend 50 hours in the water before being rescued.
The battle lasted 2.5 hours. The Japanese had every advantage: bigger guns, thicker armor, more ships, superior speed. By all logic, they should have annihilated Taffy 3 in 30 minutes. But the destroyer's suicidal attacks, combined with desperate airstrikes from the escort carrier's aircraft and a rain squall that hid the American ships, convinced the Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, that he faced a much larger force. At 9:25 a.m., just as victory was in his grasp, Kurita ordered his ships to break off the attack. The battle off Samar was over. The American landing forces were saved. The cost was terrible. Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were sunk. The destroyer escort USS Dennis was sunk. 2 escort carriers were sunk. Over 1,000 American sailors died off Samar. But the Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers, and more importantly, they lost their last chance to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. Admiral Sprague would later say, "In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off Samar." Yet for years the battle off Samar remained largely unknown, overshadowed by the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which it was a part. The destroyer squadron's war continued into 1945. As American forces drew closer to Japan, destroyers faced new horrors: kamikazes. Japanese pilots, trained to die, dove their aircraft into American ships, and destroyers, positioned as radar pickets to provide early warning of kamikaze attacks, bore the brunt of these suicide strikes. Off Okinawa, from April to June 1945, destroyers fought the most intense air battle in naval history. The destroyer USS Laffey, a different ship from the Laffey lost at Guadalcanal, survived hits by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs in 80 minutes, her crew fighting fires, repairing damage, and shooting down attacking aircraft, even as their ship seemed certain to sink. Laffey survived, but 32 of her crew died. The destroyer USS Callahan was not so lucky. Hit by 2 kamikazes, she sank within minutes, taking 47 crew members with her. The statistics from Okinawa are staggering. 15 destroyers were sunk. 87 more were damaged, many so badly they never returned to service. Kamikazes killed more than 1,100 destroyer sailors off Okinawa alone. The destroyer sailors called their ships floating coffins and their stations suicide picket duty. But they stayed at their posts, knowing that every kamikaze they shot down, every warning they radioed back to the fleet, saved lives on the bigger ships and on the beaches of Okinawa. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American destroyers were among the first ships to enter Tokyo Bay. The men who stood on their decks, watching the surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri, had fought in every major battle of the Pacific War. They had survived typhoons and kamikazes, submarines and surface battles, the tropical heat, and the terror of night combat. Of the 349 destroyers that served in the Pacific, 45 were sunk. Thousands of destroyer sailors died. Thousands more were wounded. They escorted carriers through every invasion, screened battleships in every bombardment, hunted submarines in every sea lane, rescued downed aviators on every front. Without destroyers, the Pacific War could not have been won. Yet their story remains undertold, overshadowed by the glamour of carrier aviation and the traditional prestige of battleships. The reasons are complex. Destroyers fought in dozens of small actions rather than a few large battles. Their victories were often defensive: a convoy protected, a carrier saved, a landing force screened, rather than the offensive triumphs that make for dramatic headlines. Their losses, though proportionally higher than any other ship type, came in 1s and 2s rather than the shocking mass casualties of a sunken carrier or battleship. And perhaps most significantly, Destroyer sailors were largely enlisted men and junior officers without the seniority or connections to ensure their stories were prominently told in the post-war years. But the destroyer sailors knew their worth. They knew that when the carriers retreated, destroyers stayed. When the battleships turned back, destroyers pressed forward. When the order was to attack against impossible odds, destroyers attacked. Commander Ernest Evans, moments before leading Johnston to her death, told his crew, "I intend to go in harm's way." That phrase, borrowed from John Paul Jones, captured the ethos of every destroyer squadron in the Pacific. They went in harm's way because someone had to. They fought impossible battles because the alternative was surrender. They died protecting ships and men they would never meet in actions that would never be famous. The men who served in the destroyer squadrons came home to a nation ready to move on from war. They returned to farms and factories, to small towns and big cities, carrying memories they rarely shared. The nightmares came, the sound of shells screaming in, the flash of torpedoes in dark water, the faces of shipmates who didn't make it home. But they had done their duty, and that was enough. They married, raised families, built careers. Some stayed in the Navy, rising through the ranks. Others left the service and never spoke of the war again. As the decades passed, their numbers dwindled. The destroyers themselves were mostly scrapped, their steel recycled into cars and buildings. A few were preserved as museums, their empty corridors and silent gun mounts offering only hints of the fury and fear that once filled them.
In recent years, historians and researchers have begun to give destroyer squadrons their due recognition. Books like Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James Hornfisher brought the battle off Samar to wider attention. Documentaries have explored destroyer actions at Guadalcanal and Okinawa. Naval historians have analyzed the tactical innovations developed by destroyer squadrons, recognizing how profoundly they influenced modern naval warfare. The aggressive, coordinated attacks perfected by destroyers in the Pacific became the foundation for modern surface warfare tactics. The radar-guided gunnery they pioneered evolved into today's computerized fire control systems. The close-in anti-aircraft defense they provided to carriers presaged the layered air defense systems of modern naval task forces. Yet even now, the full scope of the destroyer squadron's contribution remains incompletely understood. For every famous battle like Samar, there were dozens of convoy escorts, shore bombardments, anti-submarine patrols, and rescue operations that passed unnoticed except by those directly involved. For every Medal of Honor recipient, like Ernest Evans, there were hundreds of sailors who performed equally brave actions that went unrecorded. The destroyer squadron's war was not one of dramatic turning points, but of grinding attrition. Not of glorious victories, but of duty done day after grinding day. The Pacific War was won by many factors: American industrial might, code-breaking intelligence, carrier aviation, submarine warfare, and the courage of Marines and soldiers who stormed hostile beaches. But none of it would have been possible without the destroyers. They were the connective tissue of the Pacific Fleet, the ships that made everything else work. They escorted the carriers that won air superiority. They screened the battleships that provided fire support. They protected the transports that delivered troops and supplies. They rescued the airmen who would fly again. They stood between the Japanese Navy and the American invasion beaches, and, when necessary, they sacrificed themselves so that others might survive. On the 50th anniversary of the battle off Samar, the surviving crew members of Johnston, Hull, Hireman, Samuel B. Roberts, and the other ships of Taffy 3 gathered in Long Beach, California. They were old men by then, their hands shaking, their memories fading, but they remembered their ships and their shipmates. They told stories that their families had never heard, shared grief they had carried alone for 5 decades. They honored the men who didn't come home, speaking names that had been silent too long. And they affirmed what they had always known, that on the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, they had done something extraordinary. They had proven that courage and determination could triumph over superior firepower, that spirit could overcome steel, that men in tin cans could stand against battleships and win. This is the untold story of the Pacific destroyer squadrons, not a story of one battle or one ship, but of hundreds of actions, thousands of sailors, and 4 years of war fought at the edge of human endurance. It is a story of young men who left home never having seen the ocean and came back admirals, of sailors who served on 4 or 5 different destroyers as each was sunk beneath them, of ships that survived dozens of battles only to be scrapped unceremoniously when the war ended, of memorial services held at sea, the dead committed to the depths they had fought to control, of small towns that lost entire classes of graduates when a destroyer went down, of families that received telegrams beginning, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you." It is also a story of innovation and adaptation. The destroyer tactics that began the war were obsolete by its end, transformed by radar, improved torpedoes, better damage control, and the hard lessons of combat. The destroyer sailors of 1945 were professionals in a way the sailors of 1941 could not have imagined, trained to a precision born of necessity. The Navy that emerged from the Pacific War owed much of its doctrine and many of its leaders to the destroyer squadrons that had fought from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. The legacy of the Pacific destroyer squadrons extends beyond tactics and technology. They demonstrated that in the crucible of war, ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things. The farm boy from Iowa could become a skilled radar operator. The factory worker from Detroit could become a damage control expert who saved his ship. The high school graduate from Painted Post could become a commander who led his destroyer into legend. The destroyer squadrons were the most democratic part of the Navy, where performance mattered more than background, where courage counted more than connections. In the waters off Samar, 2,000 feet down, the wreck of USS Johnston rests on the seafloor, her hull still showing the scars of her final battle. In Iron Bottom Sound, the wrecks of Laffey, Cushing, Monson, Barton, and dozens of other destroyers lie scattered across the bottom, monuments to valor that few will ever see. In harbors across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, the ghosts of destroyer squadrons remain, ships that fought and died in waters that are now peaceful, crews that sacrificed everything for a victory they knew they might not live to see.
The story of the Pacific destroyer squadrons is ultimately a human story, a narrative of courage and sacrifice, fear and determination, death and survival. It is the story of men who climbed into tin cans and sailed into harm's way, who fought when retreat was logical, who stood when surrender was reasonable, who died so that others might live. They were not supermen or heroes in the Hollywood sense. They were sailors doing their duty, scared and exhausted, far from home, and fighting an enemy who showed no mercy. But in those moments of crisis, when the Japanese battleships appeared on the horizon, when the kamikazes dove from the sky, when the torpedoes raced through the darkness, they did not flinch. They stood to their guns and fought. The destroyer squadron's contributions extended far beyond the famous battles that history remembers. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, where distances staggered the imagination and supply lines stretched thousands of miles across hostile waters, destroyers became the unsung guardians of America's maritime lifeline. Every gallon of fuel that powered an aircraft carrier, every bullet that a Marine fired on a contested beach, every can of rations that fed a soldier on some remote jungle island, all of it crossed the Pacific in merchant ships that relied on destroyers for protection. The convoy war in the Pacific never achieved the fame of the Atlantic's Battle of the Atlantic, but it was no less vital and no less deadly. Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific sea lanes with determination equal to their German counterparts in the Atlantic. American intelligence officers estimated that Japanese submarines sank more than 500 Allied merchant ships during the war, taking thousands of tons of irreplaceable supplies to the bottom and killing thousands of merchant sailors. The destroyers assigned to convoy escort duty faced a grinding, thankless task. Weeks at sea, zigzagging endlessly to confound submarine targeting, dropping depth charges on every sonar contact, real or imagined, knowing that one successful submarine attack could destroy months of accumulated supplies and doom an entire military operation. The destroyer USS England achieved fame in a 12-day period in May 1944, when she sank 6 Japanese submarines, a record unmatched by any other ship in any navy. Her captain, Commander Walton Pendleton, and her crew had perfected the deadly art of anti-submarine warfare. They worked their sonar equipment with the skill of concert musicians, interpreting the faint pings and echoes that revealed submarines hiding in the thermal layers of the tropical Pacific. They refined the timing of their depth charge patterns, adjusting for water temperature and pressure, calculating the exact moment to release each charge so that the explosions would bracket the submarine with crushing force. Each kill followed the same terrible pattern: the sharp crack of depth charges detonating deep below, followed by debris rising to the surface, pieces of wood, oil slicks, personal items, and sometimes bodies. The crew of England took no pleasure in these kills. They understood that Japanese submariners were sailors like themselves, doing their duty, dying far from home. But the war demanded such deaths, and England's crew delivered them with professional efficiency. Convoy escort was exhausting work that tested a destroyer crew's endurance as severely as any surface battle. The ships maintained constant vigilance, crews standing watch 4 hours on, 4 hours off, for weeks without respite. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by general quarters alarms that sent men scrambling to battle stations. Hot meals were rare luxuries. More often, sailors ate cold sandwiches at their posts. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly by day, turning steel decks into griddles that could blister unprotected skin. At night, the darkness was absolute. No lights allowed, lest they provide beacons for submarines or aircraft. Men stumbled through dark passageways, navigating by memory and touch, always ready for the torpedo that might strike without warning. The psychological strain wore on everyone. Sonar operators developed nervous conditions from staring at their scopes for hours, listening to the endless ping of active sonar, trying to distinguish between a submarine's echo and the false returns from schools of fish, thermal layers, or underwater mountains. Depth charge crews stood ready at their stations, knowing that seconds of delay could mean the difference between sinking a submarine and becoming its victim. Officers on the bridge calculated endless navigation problems, trying to anticipate where submarines might lurk, which routes offered the safest passage, how to position their destroyers to provide maximum protection for their charges. And everyone lived with the knowledge that a single torpedo could tear their ship apart in seconds, sending them into water where sharks gathered and rescue might never come. Yet convoy escort operations rarely generated headlines. There were no dramatic battles to capture public imagination, no clear victories to celebrate. Success in convoy escort was measured in negative terms: ships that didn't sink, supplies that arrived intact, merchant sailors who completed their voyages alive. The destroyers that performed this vital work did so in obscurity, their crews sustained only by the knowledge that they were enabling the vast offensive that would eventually win the war. Shore bombardment represented another unglamorous but essential destroyer mission. Before every amphibious landing, destroyers closed to within a few thousand yards of enemy-held beaches and pounded Japanese positions with their 5-inch guns. This was dangerous work. Japanese coastal artillery often outranged destroyer guns, and shore batteries, concealed in caves and reinforced bunkers, proved maddeningly difficult to destroy. The destroyers had to steam slowly parallel to the beach, presenting perfect targets to enemy gunners, while firing as rapidly as possible to suppress enemy defenses before the Marines landed.
The destroyer USS Lewis learned this lesson brutally during the bombardment of Ormoc Bay in the Philippines in December 1944. As Lewis fired on Japanese positions ashore, a Japanese kamikaze dove out of low clouds and crashed into her port side, the aircraft's bomb penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The blast killed 47 men instantly and started fires that threatened Lewis's magazines. Only desperate damage control efforts saved the ship. Her crew fought the fires for 3 hours, throwing burning debris overboard, flooding compartments to prevent explosions, carrying wounded shipmates up from spaces filled with smoke and flame. Lewis survived, but she bore scars, both physical and psychological, that would never completely heal. Other destroyers were not so fortunate. The destroyer USS Cooper, providing fire support for the invasion of Ormoc, was struck by a Japanese torpedo that broke her in half. She sank in less than a minute, so quickly that most of her crew had no time to reach life rafts. Of her complement of 327 men, 191 died. The survivors spent hours in the water, clinging to debris, fending off sharks, watching helplessly as Japanese destroyers passed nearby, their crews ignoring the American sailors struggling in the water. When rescue finally came, the survivors were in such poor condition that several died shortly after being pulled from the sea. Shore bombardment claimed destroyers in other ways, too. The destroyer USS Halligan struck a mine while bombarding Okinawa in March 1945. The explosion tore a massive hole in her hull, breaking her back and flooding her engine spaces. She sank in 90 seconds, taking 15 crew members with her. The destroyer USS Emmons, also off Okinawa, was hit by 5 kamikazes in 30 minutes. With her entire forward section ablaze and explosions racking her hull, her captain ordered abandon ship. The destroyer USS Ellison came alongside to take off survivors while continuing to fight off kamikaze attacks. When it became clear that Emmons could not be saved, American forces torpedoed her to prevent her from falling into enemy hands, a final indignity for a ship that had fought valiantly to the end. The destroyer sailors who survived these ordeals often spoke of the peculiar nature of their fear. In a surface battle, they could see the enemy, could watch their shells strike home, could feel that they were actively fighting back. But during shore bombardments or kamikaze attacks, they were largely helpless. Gunners fired at targets they could barely see, hidden in caves or jungle. Kamikaze attacks came with terrifying speed, aircraft appearing suddenly and diving before anyone could react. Men stood at their stations knowing that death might come at any instant, from any direction, without warning or chance to defend themselves. This helplessness, perhaps more than any other factor, eroded morale and created psychological casualties that would haunt veterans for decades. Yet destroyer crews developed their own methods of coping. Dark humor became a survival mechanism. Sailors joked about getting torpedoed when they meant getting drunk on illicit alcohol. They nicknamed particularly dangerous assignments suicide runs and volunteered anyway. They made bets on how many kamikazes they could shoot down, knowing that gallows humor was better than dwelling on the probability of death. They formed bonds with shipmates that transcended ordinary friendship, connections forged in shared terror, tempered by mutual dependence, strengthened by the certain knowledge that your survival depended on the man at the next gun, the next station, the next watch. Mail call became the most important event in a destroyer's routine. Letters from home, from wives, girlfriends, parents, siblings, provided precious connection to the world beyond the war. Sailors read and reread letters until the paper wore thin, memorizing every word, treasuring every photograph. They wrote back when they could, carefully censoring their own letters to avoid revealing ship movements or operations, trying to sound cheerful and confident, while concealing the fear and exhaustion that consumed them. Some sailors received Dear John letters, informing them that girlfriends had found someone else or wives wanted divorces. These letters devastated the men who received them, destroying morale already stretched thin by combat stress and separation. The Navy tried to provide relief when possible. When destroyers returned to rear area bases for resupply and maintenance, crews received liberty, shore leave to forget the war for a few hours. The Navy established recreation facilities on islands across the Pacific, where sailors could drink beer, watch movies, play baseball, swim in the ocean, and pretend briefly that they were not at war. These respites were precious, but they were also too short. Most destroyers spent only days in port before returning to the combat zones. Their crews never fully rested, their ships never completely repaired. The physical toll of continuous operations manifested in various ways. Sailors lost weight, their rations inadequate to replace calories burned through constant physical labor and stress. They developed tropical diseases, malaria, dengue, and dysentery, that the ship's pharmacist mates treated with limited supplies and knowledge. They suffered from combat fatigue, what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who couldn't sleep, who jumped at sudden noises, who froze at their stations when action came. The Navy had little understanding of psychological casualties in 1943 or 1944. Men who broke down were often labeled cowards or mingerers, transferred to shore duty with no treatment or support.
Equipment failures plagued destroyer operations throughout the war. The Mark 14 torpedoes that destroyers carried into battle were notoriously unreliable early in the war, often running too deep, failing to explode on contact, or even circling back toward the ship that launched them. Destroyer captains reported these failures repeatedly, but the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance refused to acknowledge problems until overwhelming evidence forced action. It was not until mid-1943 that torpedo reliability improved to acceptable levels. By then, dozens of attacks had failed due to defective torpedoes, and men had died because their weapons didn't work. Radar systems, while revolutionary, were temperamental and required constant maintenance. A destroyer's radar could provide crucial early warning of air or surface threats, but only if it worked. Radar technicians, many of them trained in schools that barely understood the new technology themselves, worked miracles keeping the finicky equipment operational. They scavenged parts from damaged ships, improvised repairs with whatever materials they could find, and occasionally resorted to percussive maintenance, hitting malfunctioning equipment with wrenches that sometimes actually worked. The 5-inch guns that were a destroyer's main armament were magnificent weapons when they worked properly, capable of firing 15 rounds per minute with reasonable accuracy. But sustained firing caused barrels to overheat and wear out, reducing accuracy and sometimes causing catastrophic failures. Gun crews learned to pace their fire when possible, but in desperate actions like the battle off Samar, they fired until their guns literally fell apart. The destroyer USS Heerman's gun crews fired so many rounds during that battle that 2 of her guns cracked their barrels and had to be taken out of service. Mechanical breakdowns were constant concerns. Destroyers were powered by steam turbines that required skilled engineering crews to maintain. Boiler failures could leave a destroyer dead in the water, helpless before enemy attack. Engine room crews, snipes in Navy slang, worked in spaces where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, monitoring gauges, adjusting valves, performing repairs while the ship maneuvered violently during combat. These men rarely saw the enemy, never fired a shot in anger, but the ship's survival depended on their work. When destroyers sank, engine room crews often died at their posts, trapped below by rising water or unable to escape through damaged hatches. The destroyer tender system provided crucial support for maintaining the destroyer fleet. These large ships, converted from merchant hulls or purpose-built, served as floating repair yards, carrying machine shops, spare parts, and repair crews that could fix battle damage and perform maintenance that would otherwise require a return to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. Destroyer tenders stationed at forward bases like Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands enabled destroyers to remain in combat zones for months, getting repaired and resupplied without the long voyage home. The sailors who served on destroyer tenders rarely saw combat, but their work was no less vital. They worked around the clock, welding patches over shell holes, replacing damaged equipment, manufacturing parts that were no longer available from standard supply chains. A destroyer tender crew might work on 3 or 4 destroyers simultaneously, prioritizing repairs to get ships back into action as quickly as possible. They took pride in their work, knowing that a properly welded patch or a correctly installed pump might save lives in the next battle. As the war progressed into 1945, the nature of destroyer operations changed. With the Japanese Navy effectively destroyed after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, destroyers faced fewer surface threats, but the kamikaze campaign intensified, and destroyers bore the brunt of these suicide attacks. The Navy established radar picket stations around Okinawa, positions 15 to 50 miles from the main fleet, where destroyers would provide early warning of kamikaze attacks. These picket stations became known as Coffin Corner for their deadly nature. But statistics from the Okinawa campaign tell the story starkly. From April to June 1945, kamikazes sank 15 destroyers and damaged 87 more, many beyond economical repair. Destroyer casualties at Okinawa exceeded casualties at any other single operation of the Pacific War. The destroyer USS Laffey, which survived 6 kamikaze hits in 80 minutes on April 16, 1945, became famous for her endurance. But she was exceptional. Most destroyers that took multiple kamikaze hits sank.
The destroyer USS Abiel was struck by 2 kamikazes within minutes on April 12, 1945. The first aircraft crashed into her port side, starting fires. Before damage control crews could respond, a second kamikaze struck her amidships, breaking her back. Abiel broke in half and sank in 5 minutes, taking 79 crew members with her. The destroyer USS Manert L. Abiel, there were 2 destroyers with similar names, was struck by a Japanese Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze, a weapon the Americans called a Baka bomb. The Oka's 2,600-pound warhead punched through Abiel's thin hull and exploded inside the ship, blowing her apart. She sank in 3 minutes, so quickly that only 82 of her crew of 331 survived. The psychological impact of the kamikaze campaign cannot be overstated. Destroyer sailors could train for surface combat, could prepare for submarine attacks, could drill on damage control procedures. But there was no effective defense against a pilot determined to die. Gunners might shoot down 90% of attacking kamikazes, but the 10th one would get through, and that was enough. Sailors on radar picket duty developed fatalistic attitudes, assuming they would be hit, hoping only that the damage would not be fatal. Some men broke under the strain, refusing to leave sheltered spaces, freezing at their battle stations. Others doubled down on their duties, manning their guns with grim determination, knowing that every kamikaze they shot down might save another ship. The destroyer USS Callahan's final action illustrated both the horror and the courage of the radar picket duty. On July 28, 1945, just weeks before the war would end, Callahan was on picket duty when Japanese aircraft attacked. Her gunners shot down several attackers, but 2 kamikazes got through. The first crashed into Callahan's starboard side, its bomb exploding in the after engine room. The second kamikaze struck moments later, hitting near the bridge. Fires erupted throughout the ship. The captain was killed instantly.
Power failed. Ammunition began cooking off in the heat. The surviving officers ordered abandon ship, and the crew went over the side into the dark water. 47 men died with Callahan. The survivors spent the night in the water, cold and exhausted, listening to their ship's death throes, the creak of tortured metal, the hiss of steam, the splash as equipment fell from her tilting decks. At dawn, Callahan rolled over and sank, one of the last destroyers lost in the Pacific War. Yet even in these final desperate months, destroyer crews found reasons to persevere. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while ending the war, vindicated every sacrifice. The men who had fought on destroyers from 1941 to 1945 knew that without their service, without the supplies they had protected, the beachheads they had bombarded, the carriers they had screened, the submarines they had sunk, victory would have been impossible, or would have required an invasion of Japan that might have cost millions of lives. This knowledge sustained them through the nightmares, through the survivor's guilt, through the long years of readjustment to civilian life. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, destroyer crews celebrated with the same restrained enthusiasm as the rest of the Navy. They were too exhausted, too numbed by years of combat to feel the unbridled joy that swept through American cities. They thought of shipmates who would never come home, of destroyers resting on the bottom of the Pacific, of all the fear and death and suffering that had finally, mercifully ended. They wanted to go home, to sleep in beds that didn't rock with the sea, to eat food that wasn't served on steel trays, to live without fear of sudden death. The journey home was bittersweet. As destroyers made their final voyages back to Pearl Harbor, to San Diego, to the Navy yards where they would be decommissioned, their crews reflected on what they had experienced and endured. Many would remain in the Navy, their peacetime careers built on wartime service. Others would leave the Navy as quickly as possible, eager to reclaim the civilian lives that war had interrupted. But all carried memories that would never fade completely. The roar of guns in night battles, the scream of kamikazes diving from the sky, the faces of friends who died beside them, the peculiar smell of a destroyer at sea, a mixture of fuel oil, salt water, sweat, and cordite that would trigger flashbacks decades later. The destroyer squadron's legacy extended far beyond their wartime achievements. The tactics they developed, coordinated attacks using radar and radio communications, aggressive maneuvering at high speed, and precise gunnery under the most difficult conditions became foundational to modern naval warfare. The officers who commanded destroyers in the Pacific, men like Arleigh Burke, would rise to positions of high command and shape the Navy for decades. Burke became Chief of Naval Operations and served an unprecedented 3 terms, longer than anyone before or since, transforming the Navy into the modern force capable of projecting power anywhere in the world. He never forgot the lessons learned in the Pacific destroyer squadrons, and those lessons influenced every decision he made.
The destroyer itself evolved after the war, growing larger and more capable, eventually giving rise to the guided missile destroyers that formed the backbone of today's Navy. But the essential nature of the destroyer, a fast, maneuverable, multi-mission warship capable of fighting surface, subsurface, and air threats, remained unchanged. The modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, named for the legendary destroyer squadron commander, carry on the tradition established by their World War II predecessors. They are still called upon to screen carriers, to protect supply lines, to patrol dangerous waters, to place themselves in harm's way so that others might be protected. For the men who served in the Pacific destroyer squadrons, the passage of years brought both healing and renewed pain. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety that they rarely discussed, even with their families. The culture of the 1950s and 1960s discouraged talking about such problems. Men were expected to simply endure. Some turned to alcohol to numb their memories. Others threw themselves into work, building careers and families while trying to outrun the ghosts that followed them home from the Pacific.
Reunions became important as veterans aged. Former crew members gathered to remember their ships and shipmates, to tell stories that only they could fully understand. These gatherings were emotional affairs, where old men wept openly, embraced friends they hadn't seen in decades, and spoke names that had been silent too long. They visited the handful of preserved World War II destroyers that survived as museum ships, walking familiar decks, showing grandchildren where they had stood during battles fought before those grandchildren's parents were born. They explained how destroyer life had shaped them, how it had taught them courage and endurance, and the value of brotherhood. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the number of Pacific War destroyer veterans dwindled rapidly. The youngest veterans, those who had enlisted in 1945, reached their 80s and 90s. Ships that had been preserved as museums began to rust and decay, their maintenance costs exceeding available funding. Historical societies scrambled to record oral histories before the last veterans passed away. Researchers dove on destroyer wrecks in the Pacific, using modern technology to explore ships that had lain untouched for 70 years, hoping to understand what happened in those final moments, to perhaps bring closure to families who had never known the full story of how their loved ones died. The wreck of USS Johnston, found in 2019 at a depth of 21,180 feet, sparked renewed interest in destroyer operations during World War II. Images of Johnston's bow, still proudly pointing forward as if leading one final charge, appeared in newspapers and on television. The story of her last battle was told again, and millions of Americans learned for the first time about the destroyers that fought at Samar. For the few surviving crew members, it was vindication, proof that their service, their sacrifice, had not been forgotten. The destroyer squadron's story is ultimately America's story, a narrative of ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary challenges, of a nation finding within itself reserves of courage and determination that perhaps it hadn't known it possessed. The young men who crewed those destroyers came from every corner of America, from every background, united by nothing more than the uniforms they wore and the oath they had taken. They were not natural warriors. They did not seek glory. They simply did what was asked of them, and what was asked was terrible beyond imagining. They stood on pitching decks in the middle of the night, firing at enemies they could barely see, knowing that the next shell might kill them. They manned their stations during kamikaze attacks, watching death dive from the sky, holding their fire until the last possible second to ensure a kill. They pulled drowning shipmates from burning water, risked their own lives to save others, stayed at their posts when every instinct screamed to flee. They watched friends die in ways no one should have to witness, and then returned to those same posts the next day, ready to do it all again. This was not glamorous. This was not the war of Hollywood movies or stirring speeches. This was dirty, terrifying, exhausting work done by men who were often too young to vote, too young to buy a drink, but old enough to die for their country. They deserved to be remembered, to have their stories told, to be honored not just for their victories, but for their service, for the simple fact that when their nation called, they answered.
The Pacific destroyer squadrons fought in every major operation of the Pacific War, and dozens of minor ones. They were present at every triumph and every disaster. When the war began with catastrophe at Pearl Harbor, destroyers were there, their crews struggling to rescue sailors from burning battleships. When the war ended with Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay, destroyers were there, their crews standing at attention as the surrender documents were signed. In between, across 4 years of brutal combat, they proved that courage was not a matter of size or firepower, but of spirit, that men in tin cans could accomplish what men in battleships could not, that determination could overcome disadvantage, that sacrifice was never meaningless. Their story reminds us that freedom is never free, that peace must be earned, that the cost of civilization is measured in lives given freely in its defense. Every destroyer sailor who went to sea knowing he might not return, every captain who led his ship into impossible odds, every gun crew that stayed at their station while the world exploded around them. They were not heroes in some abstract sense. They were young men doing what they believed was right, protecting their shipmates, serving their country, trusting that their sacrifice had meaning. And it did. The world we inhabit today, with all its imperfections and challenges, exists because men like them stood watch in distant waters, fought battles most people have never heard of, and died in places whose names appear on no memorial. The Pacific Destroyer Squadron's war was a hard war, fought without mercy and offering none, but it was a necessary war, and it was won by men who refused to quit no matter the odds. Their legacy is not just tactical innovations or strategic victories. It is the example they set of duty fulfilled, of courage maintained, of sacrifice freely given. In an age of professional militaries and technological warfare, it is easy to forget that war is ultimately a human endeavor, won or lost by the courage and determination of individual men and women. The Pacific Destroyer Squadrons never forgot this truth because they lived it every day for 4 long years. This is their story, told at last. The story of the tin cans and the brave men who rode them into battle, who fought against impossible odds, who died far from home in waters that would become their graves. They earned the right to be remembered, and we bear the obligation to remember them, to tell their stories to new generations, to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain, and their service is never forgotten. They were the Pacific Destroyer Squadrons, and though their numbers have dwindled to nothing, and their ships have long since turned to rust, their spirit endures, a testament to what Americans can accomplish when duty calls and freedom hangs in the balance. This is their story, told at last.